Hello, I'll be making an argument against points that are present within Thomas Nagel's essay on sexual perversion. Foremost, I must explain that my argument will not be based within the central controversy of his essay, that being an attempt to define what is and is not sexually perverse. Rather, I'll be arguing against Nagel's viewpoints on human sexuality and desire in general, and his comments stating that it is socially reliant. There are three conditions which Nagel claims must be met if a desire or practice is to be considered perverse. He says first, if there are any sexual perversions, they will have to be sexual desires or practices that can be plausibly described as in some sense unnatural. Second, he states that sexual practice unadorned with the outlying behavior is quote-unquote normal sex. And third, if there are perversions, they will be unnatural sexual inclinations rather than merely unnatural practices adopted not from inclination but for other reasons. A sexual perversion must reveal in itself conduct which expresses an unnatural sexual preference. Furthermore, Nagel claims that perversions are based in psychology, which is where my opposition with him begins. He continually states that sexual desire is a feeling about other persons, and is therefore socially based. Indeed, nearly every example he uses contemplates a relationship that exists between multiple people, and the sexuality between them. This seems to forego instances of masturbation. The foundation for Nagel's entire argument is flawed if we can consider that one can be sexually desirous of themselves without needing social contact. Let's consider a character, we'll call him Ronnie. Ronnie touches himself without the company of another person, nor the desire to be in contact with another person. All that he focuses on are the functions of his own body, and his desires only for himself and his eventual climax. If we can understand this, then would any perversion apply to Ronnie, since his sexuality and desires are isolated? Nagel does not make this clear. Likewise, we can argue against a point that Nagel makes later in the article, where he compares the nature of love to a good omelet. Nagel explains that people find love in the same way that they enjoy an omelet. It is based in specific traits that they are attracted to. Just as someone likes omelets for being fluffy or juicy or what have you, love can be found because somebody has a beautiful figure, or their hair looks soft, or they have pretty feet. In both cases, we generalize these specific desires. We enjoy omelets, not specifically fluffiness or juiciness, and we are in love or desirous, not simply intrigued by good hair or skin. He goes on to state, though, that while any old omelet could quench your hunger, our sexual appetite is changed from person to person. Once again, in the case of our friend Ronnie, this may not be true. Now Ronnie is just looking to get off, so it doesn't matter who or what helps him to do it. In this way, he objectifies his own sexuality, and any partner would be appropriate for him so long as he has sex with the first man or woman he sees. In this way, his sexual desires are comparable to hunger, which Nagel had tried to separate in his own argument. Nagel also argues that sexual desire ideally contains an exchange of perception, otherwise it may be perverse. We perceive the form of another person, and they perceive us. We then perceive their perception of us, and they do the same, and so forth. He writes, if the partners in heterosexual intercourse indulge in private heterosexual fantasies, that obscures the recognition of the real partner. Now let us consider another scenario. John and Jane are a married couple who engage regularly in sex. Tonight in particular, though, John is distracted by thoughts of his 1040 tax return which he has yet to fill out. So instead of being fully engaged in the exchange of sexual perception with his wife, his mind is wandering to work, income, and mortgage payments. Therefore, he does not properly recognize his partner in the act of sex, which Nagel would seem to argue to be perverse. This, however, seems to be a radical judgment. Nagel's arguments also seem to be slightly outdated, at least from a social standpoint. He writes, certainly there is much support for an aggressive-passive distinction between male and female sexuality. In our culture, the male's arousal tends to initiate the perceptual exchange. He usually makes the sexual approach, largely controls the course of the act, and of course penetrates, whereas the woman receives. When two men or two women engage in intercourse, they cannot both adhere to these sexual roles. Now, certainly since the 1960s, our perception of gay sexuality and culture has shifted enormously, and so has our perception of gender roles in society. Men are not always necessarily the dominant force in sexuality, and the aggressive passive distinction has faded somewhat in these past 50 years. The overall point of my argument against Nagel's claims are simply to ensure that it is understood that exceptions exist to every rule, especially rules of psychology. While desire and perversion can certainly be generalized for a majority, there are always outlying tendencies that may refute the whole concept.